Long ago, in the days when the Persian Empire stretched from the distant lands of India to the sun-scorched deserts of Ethiopia, there ruled a king whose power was unmatched across 127 provinces. His name was Ahasuerus, known to some as Xerxes, and from his magnificent palace in Susa, his word was law. This is the story of an orphan Jewish girl who would become queen. A story of courage in the face of death, of faith when all seemed lost, and of how one person's bravery would save an entire nation from destruction. This is the story of Esther. In the 3rd year of his reign, King Ahasuerus decided to display the vast wealth and splendor of his kingdom. He held a feast that would last not days, not weeks, but 180 days. Officials and nobles from every corner of the empire gathered in Susa to witness the glory of Persia. The palace gardens were transformed into a wonderland of white and blue linen hangings, fastened with cords of fine purple linen to silver rings and marble pillars. Couches of gold and silver rested upon a mosaic pavement of porphyry, marble, mother of pearl, and precious stones. Wine flowed freely from golden vessels, each one different from the last, and there was no restriction on the drinking, for the king had ordered all the palace officials to do as each guest desired. While King Ahasuerus held his great feast for the men, Queen Vashti hosted her own celebration for the women in the royal palace. She was known throughout the land for her beauty, her dignity, and her grace. On the 7th day of the final banquet, when the king's heart was merry with wine, he commanded his 7 eunuchs to bring Queen Vashti before him, wearing her royal crown. He wanted all his guests, all the nobles and officials, to gaze upon her beauty, for she was lovely to behold. But when the eunuchs delivered the king's command, Queen Vashti refused to come. The king was furious. His anger burned within him like fire. Never before had anyone defied his command so publicly, so completely. He immediately summoned his wise men, those who understood the laws and customs of Persia and Media, to ask them what must be done. Memucan, one of the 7 princes who had special access to the king, stepped forward. His words were careful, calculated, and cold. He declared that Queen Vashti had wronged not only the king, but every noble and every person throughout all the provinces. He warned that when the women of Persia and Media heard what the queen had done, they would look with contempt upon their own husbands, saying King Ahasuerus commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, but she did not come. And so, Memucan advised, let a royal decree be issued and written among the laws of Persia and Media, so that it cannot be revoked. Queen Vashti is never again to enter the presence of King Ahasuerus. And let the king give her royal position to another who is better than she. The advice pleased the king and the princes. The decree was written and sent throughout the empire, translated into the language and script of every province, proclaiming that every man should be master in his own household. And so Queen Vashti was banished from the royal presence, her crown stripped away, her throne left empty. What King Ahasuerus did not know, what none of them could have known, was that this moment of rage and pride would set in motion events that would determine the fate of an entire people. The throne stood empty, waiting for the one who would fill it. After some time had passed and the king's anger had subsided, he remembered Vashti, what she had done and what had been decreed against her. The emptiness beside his throne had become a constant reminder. The king's personal attendants proposed a solution. Let beautiful young virgins be sought throughout all the provinces of the empire. Let officers be appointed in every province to gather them to Susa, to the citadel, to the harem under the care of Hegai, the king's eunuch who was in charge of the women. Let beauty treatments be given to them, and let the young woman who pleases the king become queen instead of Vashti. This idea pleased King Ahasuerus, and he ordered it to be done. Now in the citadel of Susa, there lived a Jewish man named Mordecai, son of Jori, son of Shimei, son of Kish, a Benjaminite. His family had been carried away from Jerusalem among the captives taken with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar king of Babylon had carried into exile. Mordecai had adopted his cousin, a young woman named Hadassah, which means myrtle. She was also known by her Persian name, Esther. Her father and mother had died, leaving her an orphan, but Mordecai had taken her as his own daughter. He raised her with love, with wisdom, and with the traditions of their people. Esther was beautiful in form and appearance, but more than that, she possessed a gentle spirit and a quiet strength. When the king's order and edict were proclaimed, and many young women were gathered in Susa under the custody of Hegai, Esther was among them. She had no choice in the matter. The king's decree applied to all. As Mordecai watched her being taken to the palace, his heart was heavy with concern for her safety. Before she left, he gave her strict instructions. Do not reveal your people or your kindred, for we do not know how this information might be used against you. Esther listened to her cousin's wisdom and kept her Jewish identity hidden. At the palace, Hegai, the eunuch in charge of the women, immediately noticed something different about Esther. She found favor in his sight and won his kindness. He quickly provided her with cosmetics and her portion of food, and he assigned 7 chosen young women from the king's palace to serve her. He moved her and her young women to the best place in the harem. All the while, Esther kept her secret. She revealed nothing of her people or her heritage, for Mordecai had commanded her not to make it known. Every day, Mordecai walked back and forth in front of the court of the harem, trying to learn how Esther was doing and what was happening to her. Though they could not speak, he watched over her from a distance, his prayers rising silently to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The preparation process for each young woman took 12 months according to the regulations for the women, 6 months with oil of myrrh and 6 months with spices and ointments for beautifying women. During this time, Esther learned the ways of the palace, the customs of the court, and how to carry herself with the grace expected of royalty. When the time came for each young woman to go to King Ahasuerus, she was allowed to take whatever she wished with her from the harem to the king's palace. She would go in the evening, and in the morning she would return to the second harem under the custody of Shashgaz, the king's eunuch who was in charge of the concubines. She would not go to the king again unless he delighted in her and she was summoned by name. One by one, the young women went before the king. One by one, they returned, and the king's heart remained unmoved. Then came Esther's turn. When the time arrived for Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had adopted her as his own daughter, to go to the king, she asked for nothing except what Hegai, the king's eunuch who had charge of the women, advised. Yet Esther won favor in the eyes of all who saw her. She was taken to King Ahasuerus in his royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month of Tevath, in the 7th year of his reign. The moment the king saw Esther, his search was over. He loved Esther more than all the women. She won grace and favor in his sight, more than all the other virgins. He set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Then the king gave a great feast for all his officials and servants, the Feast of Esther. He proclaimed a holiday throughout the provinces and gave gifts with royal generosity. Esther was now queen of Persia, ruling beside the most powerful man in the world. Yet still she kept her secret, revealing nothing of her people or her kindred, just as Mordecai had commanded. She continued to obey Mordecai, just as she had when she was being raised by him. In those days, while Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, for he had taken up a position there to remain close to Esther, 2 of the king's eunuchs, Bigthan and Teresh, who guarded the threshold, became angry and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. But their plot became known to Mordecai. He listened carefully to their whispered conversations, and when he understood their intentions, he immediately told Queen Esther, and Esther told the king in the name of Mordecai. The matter was investigated and found to be true. The 2 men were both hanged on the gallows, and it was recorded in the book of the Chronicles in the presence of the king. This act of loyalty, this moment of service, was written down and then forgotten. The scroll was closed, the record preserved but unread. Mordecai received no reward, no recognition, no honor for saving the king's life. Yet nothing in God's providence is truly forgotten. What seemed like an overlooked deed would, in time, become the hinge upon which history would turn. But that time had not yet come. For now, peace settled over the palace, and Esther served as queen, her true identity still hidden, her purpose still unknown. After these events, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, and advanced him. He set his seat above all the officials who were with him. And the king commanded that all the king's servants who were at the king's gate should bow down and pay homage to Haman, for so the king had commanded concerning him. Every day, as Haman passed through the king's gate, officials and servants would fall to their knees, their faces to the ground, offering him the reverence the king had decreed. But Mordecai did not bow down or pay homage. Day after day, this pattern continued. While others bowed, Mordecai stood. The other servants at the king's gate noticed and questioned him, "Why do you transgress the king's command?" They spoke to him day after day, urging him to conform, to bow like everyone else. But Mordecai remained firm. Finally, he revealed his reason: "I am a Jew." His people had bowed to no one but the Lord God alone. And there was another reason, deeper still. Haman was an Agagite, a descendant of Agag, the Amalekite king. The Amalekites had been ancient enemies of Israel, cursed by God for their attacks on the Israelites when they came out of Egypt. Mordecai would not bow to the descendant of such an enemy. When the other officials realized Mordecai would not change his mind, they reported the matter to Haman, eager to see whether Mordecai's words would stand. They wanted to know if his refusal would be tolerated. It would not. When Haman learned that Mordecai refused to bow down or pay homage to him, he was filled with fury. His rage was not the hot, quick anger of a moment. It was cold, calculated, and consuming. But Haman's pride would not be satisfied with punishing Mordecai alone. He disdained the thought of laying hands on Mordecai only. When they had made known to him the people of Mordecai, Haman sought to destroy all the Jews, the people of Mordecai, throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus. Not just one man, an entire people. Genocide was his solution to wounded pride. In the 12th year of King Ahasuerus, in the first month, which is the month of Nisan, Haman cast pur, that is, he cast lots, before him, day after day, month after month, until the lot fell on the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. The lots were cast to determine the most auspicious day for his plan of destruction. Haman consulted his sorcerers and astrologers, watching as the dice rolled, as fate seemed to point toward a specific date. The 13th day of the 12th month, nearly a full year away. Enough time to prepare, to plan, to ensure complete annihilation. Then Haman went to King Ahasuerus with his poison wrapped in persuasion. He spoke of a certain people scattered abroad and dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of the kingdom. He claimed their laws were different from those of every other people, and that they did not keep the king's laws. He suggested it was not to the king's profit to tolerate them. And then came the offer, if it please the king, let it be decreed that they be destroyed, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who have charge of the king's business, that they may put it into the king's treasuries. 10,000 talents, a staggering sum, enough to fund armies, to build cities, to ensure the loyalty of officials throughout the empire. The king was not paying close attention. He did not ask which people. He did not inquire about their supposed crimes. He did not consider the consequences. Instead, he removed his signet ring from his hand and gave it to Haman the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. With those simple words and that simple gesture, the king sealed the fate of an entire nation. The king said to Haman, "The money is given to you, the people also, to do with them as it seems good to you." The king's scribes were summoned immediately, on the 13th day of the first month. A decree was written, exactly as Haman commanded, to the king's satraps, to the governors over all the provinces, and to the officials of every people. It was written in the script of each province and in the language of each people, in the name of King Ahasuerus, and it was sealed with the king's ring. Letters were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces with the command to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate all Jews, young and old, women and children, in one day, the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, and to plunder their goods. A copy of the document was to be issued as a decree in every province by proclamation to all the peoples, so they would be ready for that day. The couriers went out hurriedly by order of the king, and the decree was issued in Susa the citadel. And while the king and Haman sat down to drink, the city of Susa was thrown into confusion. In the streets, in the markets, in homes throughout the city, the news spread like wildfire. The Jews heard, and their hearts broke with terror. But even among the other peoples, there was bewilderment and fear. What kind of king issues such a decree? What kind of man seeks such destruction? In his palace, Haman celebrated, raising his cup to toast his coming victory over a people whose only crime was the faithfulness of one man who would not bow. But high in the royal quarters, Queen Esther remained unaware. The decree had been issued. The lots had been cast. The 13th of Adar was marked for annihilation. And the queen, sitting safely behind palace walls, did not yet know that she was one of the condemned. When Mordecai learned all that had been done, his response was immediate and visceral. He tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes. He went out into the midst of the city, and he cried out with a loud and bitter cry. His grief was not silent or private. It was public, anguished, a wail that echoed through the streets of Susa. He went as far as the king's gate, but he could go no further, for no one was allowed to enter the king's gate clothed in sackcloth. The law would not even permit mourning in the presence of royalty. Throughout every province, wherever the king's command and his decree reached, there was great mourning among the Jews. They fasted, they wept, they wailed. Many lay in sackcloth and ashes, the ancient postures of grief and desperation. From India to Ethiopia, in every corner of the vast empire, Jewish families held each other and waited for death. When Esther's young women and her eunuchs came and told her about Mordecai, the queen was deeply distressed. She had no idea why Mordecai was mourning. She sent garments to clothe Mordecai, hoping to comfort him, to enable him to remove the sackcloth and enter the palace to speak with her. But Mordecai would not accept them. His mourning was not for personal grief that could be soothed with fine clothing. His mourning was for his people, for the sentence of death that hung over them all. Desperate to understand, Esther called for Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs who had been appointed to attend her. She ordered him to go to Mordecai and learn what was troubling him and why. Hathach went out to Mordecai in the open square of the city in front of the king's gate. There, Mordecai told him everything that had happened. He told him the exact sum of money that Haman had promised to pay into the king's treasuries for the destruction of the Jews. Mordecai also gave him a copy of the written decree issued in Susa for their destruction, so that Hathach might show it to Esther and explain it to her. He charged him to go to the king to beg his favor and plead with him on behalf of her people. When Hathach returned and told Esther what Mordecai had said, her heart must have stopped. The decree wasn't about some distant, unknown people. It was about her people. She was a Jew. She was one of the condemned. But what could she do? She was queen, yes, but she was also bound by laws even she could not break. Esther sent word back to Mordecai through Hathach, explaining the terrible reality. All the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that if any man or woman goes to the king inside the inner court without being called, there is but one law, to be put to death, except the one to whom the king holds out the golden scepter so that he may live. But as for me, I have not been called to come in to the king these 30 days. 30 days. For 30 days, the king had not summoned her. She had no reason to believe he would be pleased to see her. If she approached him uninvited, she would likely die. And if she died, what good could she do for her people then? When they told Mordecai what Esther had said, his response was not gentle or comforting. It was urgent, direct, and prophetic. Mordecai sent back this answer to Esther: "Do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this?" For such a time as this. Those words hung in the air, penetrating through Esther's fear, through her calculations of safety, through her desire for self-preservation. Everything that had happened, her parents' deaths, Mordecai adopting her, the banishment of Vashti, the gathering of virgins, her selection as queen, the keeping of her secret, all of it had led to this moment. Perhaps there were no accidents. Perhaps there was a purpose woven through every thread of her life, preparing her for a moment when silence would mean death and courage would mean risking everything. Esther made her decision. She sent this message back to Mordecai: "Go, gather all the Jews to be found in Susa, and hold a fast on my behalf. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my young women will also fast as you do. Then I will go to the king, though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. If I perish, I perish." In those 5 words, Esther transformed from a woman hiding behind palace walls to a woman willing to die for her people. She was no longer just a queen. She was a deliverer, stepping into the role destiny had prepared for her. Mordecai went away and did everything as Esther had ordered him. Throughout Susa, the word spread among the Jews. For 3 days and 3 nights, they would fast. They would not eat or drink. They would pray, though prayer is not mentioned in this account, for the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob does not need to be named to be present. And in the palace, Esther and her attendants fasted as well, preparing not just their bodies but their spirits for what was to come. 3 days of silence. 3 days of emptiness. 3 days of preparation. And then, on the 3rd day, Esther would put on her royal robes and walk toward either her death or her destiny.
On the 3rd day, Esther put on her royal robes. She had fasted for 3 days. Her body weakened, but her resolve strengthened. Dressed in the full regalia of Persian royalty, she prepared to face the king uninvited, a decision that could mean instant death. She stood in the inner court of the king's palace, directly in front of his quarters. The king sat on his royal throne inside, opposite the entrance. Everything in that moment balanced on a knife's edge. The guards watched. The courtiers held their breath. Would the king be angry at this intrusion? Would he view it as disrespect, as defiance? The law was clear: approach uninvited and die, unless the king extends his golden scepter. When the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court, his expression softened. She won his favor. Perhaps it was her beauty, the vulnerability in her eyes, or something deeper, a providence neither of them could yet see. The king held out the golden scepter that was in his hand. She lived. Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter, the ancient gesture of acceptance, of grace granted. Her gamble had succeeded, but this was only the beginning. The king said to her, "What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? It shall be given to you, even to half of my kingdom." Half the kingdom. The king's generosity flowed freely when he was pleased. But Esther didn't blurt out her real request. She had learned the ways of the Persian court. Timing was everything. Wisdom required patience. She replied, "If it pleases the king, let the king and Haman come today to a feast that I have prepared for him." A feast. Simple, elegant, unthreatening. What king could resist such an invitation? The king immediately commanded, "Bring Haman quickly, so that we may do as Esther has asked." So the king and Haman came to the feast Esther had prepared. As they drank wine, the atmosphere was pleasant, festive. The king, feeling generous and curious, asked again, "What is your wish, Queen Esther? It shall be granted. And what is your request? Even to half of my kingdom, it shall be fulfilled." This was her moment. She could expose Haman's plot, save her nation. But Esther, guided by wisdom, chose to wait. "My wish and my request is this. If I have found favor in the sight of the king, let the king and Haman come to the feast that I will prepare for them. And tomorrow I will do as the king has said." Another feast. Another delay. Why would she wait? Perhaps she needed to be certain of the king's favor. Perhaps she knew Haman needed to be present, his crimes undeniable. Or perhaps she simply trusted that when the moment was right, she would know. Haman went out that day joyful and glad of heart. He had been honored above all others, summoned not once, but twice, to dine privately with the king and queen. His pride swelled with every step. But when Haman saw Mordecai at the king's gate, and saw that Mordecai neither rose nor trembled before him, his joy turned to rage. All his honors, all his power, none of it mattered as long as this one Jew refused to bow. Haman controlled himself and went home. He sent for his friends and his wife, Zeresh. He needed an audience for his complaints. He recounted the splendor of his riches, the number of his sons, and all the promotions the king had given him. "Even Queen Esther let no one come with the king to the feast she prepared but me," he boasted. "And tomorrow I am invited by her as well, with the king. Yet all this is worth nothing to me, so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate. All his wealth, his position, his honor, all of it was poisoned because one man would not bow." His wife Zeresh and all his friends saw a simple solution. They said, "Let a gallows 50 cubits high be made, and in the morning tell the king to have Mordecai hanged on it. Then go joyfully with the king to the feast." 50 cubits, that's 75 feet tall. This wouldn't be a quiet execution. It would be a spectacle, a warning, a monument to Haman's power. Everyone in Susa would see Mordecai's body hanging high above the city. The idea pleased Haman immensely. He had the gallows made, imagining his triumph. Tomorrow morning, he would ask the king for permission. And tomorrow evening, he would celebrate at the queen's second banquet, finally free of the one thorn that pierced his perfect life. Haman went to bed satisfied, envisioning the dawn when his enemy would die. But he did not know that in the palace, the king could not sleep. He did not know that the very night he planned Mordecai's death would be the night Mordecai's forgotten loyalty would be remembered. He did not know that the gallows he built for another would become his own. The wheels of justice were turning, driven by a hand Haman could not see. That night, the king could not sleep. He tossed and turned, his mind restless. Perhaps it was the wine from the feast, or anxiety about the queen's mysterious request. Or maybe it was something else entirely, a divine insomnia, appointed for such a time as this. Unable to rest, the king commanded that the book of memorable deeds, the royal chronicles, be brought and read to him. Surely the droning recitation of official records would lull him to sleep. A servant opened the scrolls and began to read. Entry after entry, the mundane business of the empire unfolded. And then, the reader came upon an account written 5 years earlier. It was the story of how Mordecai had uncovered a plot by 2 of the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold, who had sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. The king stopped the reading. His mind sharpened, suddenly alert. Someone had saved his life. "What honor or distinction has been bestowed on Mordecai for this?" he asked. The king's servants answered, "Nothing has been done for him. Nothing." 5 years had passed, and the man who saved the king's life had received no reward, no recognition. This was not just an oversight, it was an injustice. and King Ahasuerus understood the necessity of rewarding loyalty. At that very moment, as the king was considering how to honor Mordecai, Haman entered the outer court of the king's palace. He had come to speak to the king about hanging Mordecai on the gallows he had prepared. The timing, from Haman's perspective, was perfect. He had come early to ensure he could make his request privately. The gallows stood ready. He needed only the king's permission. The king's servants announced, "Haman is there, standing in the court." The king said, "Let him come in." Haman entered, bowing low, rehearsing his lethal request in his mind. But before he could speak, the king asked him a question that would seal his fate. What should be done for the man whom the king delights to honor? Haman's heart must have leaped. Who else could the king possibly want to honor? Who else had been so favored, so recently invited to private banquets? Surely, the king was speaking of him. Haman said to himself, "Whom would the king delight to honor more than me?" And so, Haman answered the king with a fantasy of glory he had obviously rehearsed many times before. "For the man whom the king delights to honor, let royal robes be brought, which the king has worn, and the horse that the king has ridden, with a royal crown on its head. Let the robes and horse be handed to one of the king's most noble officials. Let them dress the man whom the king delights to honor, and lead him on the horse through the city square, proclaiming before him, 'Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor.'" It was extravagant, public, and unmistakable. The man would wear the king's own robes, ride the king's own horse, and be celebrated throughout the city. Haman waited for the king's approval, already picturing himself in those royal robes, hearing the proclamation echo through the streets. The king's next words shattered every one of Haman's dreams. "Hurry," the king commanded. "Take the robes and the horse, as you have said, and do so for Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. Leave out nothing that you have mentioned." The irony was staggering, the reversal of fortune complete. Haman, who had come to demand Mordecai's death, was now tasked with bestowing upon him the highest honor imaginable. Be sure to like and subscribe for more. We'll see you in the next video.
When it was over, Mordecai returned to the king's gate, resuming his place as if nothing extraordinary had happened. He did not gloat. He did not celebrate. He simply returned to his post. But Haman hurried to his home, mourning, with his head covered in shame and humiliation. He told his wife Zeresh and all his friends everything that had happened to him. His wise men and his wife Zeresh said to him, "If Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of the Jewish people, you will not overcome him but will surely fall before him." They saw what Haman, in his pride, could not see. The tide had turned. While they were still talking with him, the king's eunuchs arrived. They hurried to bring Haman to the feast that Esther had prepared. Haman had no choice but to go. So the king and Haman went in to feast with Queen Esther. And on the second day, as they were drinking wine after the feast, the king again said to Esther, "What is your wish, Queen Esther? It shall be granted you. And what is your request? Even to the half of my kingdom, it shall be fulfilled." 3 times now, the king had made this generous offer. 3 times, he had pressed her to reveal what she wanted. The moment had finally come. Esther took a breath and answered, "If I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it please the king, let my life be granted me for my wish, and my people for my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. If we had been sold merely as slaves, men and women, I would have been silent, for our affliction is not to be compared with the loss to the king. My life, my people." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. The king had assumed she was asking for jewels, for gifts, for some royal privilege. Instead, she was begging for her life. The Queen of Persia, beloved wife of the king, was asking not to be killed. King Ahasuerus spoke and said to Queen Esther, "Who is he, and where is he, who has dared to do this?" Dared. The word revealed the king's fury. Who would dare threaten the queen? Who would dare to plan such destruction? The king's anger was already rising, his protective instincts aroused. Whoever had done this would face the full wrath of the Persian throne. Esther looked directly at Haman. She spoke 3 words that would end his life: a foe and enemy. This wicked Haman. Haman's face must have gone white. The blood must have drained from his features as he realized what had just happened. Haman was terrified before the king and the queen. The king, in his wrath, rose from the feast and went into the palace garden. Perhaps he needed to cool his anger. Perhaps he needed to think. Perhaps he needed to decide what to do with a man who had manipulated him into decreeing the death of his own wife. Haman realized that the king had determined his fate. There would be no mercy, no forgiveness, no way out. In desperation, he stayed to beg Queen Esther for his life, throwing himself on the couch where Esther was reclining. It was a gesture of supplication, but it was also a violation of court protocol. No man was to approach the queen so intimately, especially not when the king was absent. At that very moment, the king returned from the palace garden to the palace where the wine was served. He saw Haman fallen on the couch where Esther was, and his fury reached its peak. Will he even assault the queen in my presence, in my own house? The words were barely out of the king's mouth when attendants covered Haman's face, the Persian sign that a man was condemned to death. There would be no trial, no further investigation, no appeal. The king had spoken, and Haman was finished. Then Harbona, one of the eunuchs in attendance on the king, said, "Moreover, the gallows that Haman has prepared for Mordecai, whose word saved the king, is standing at Haman's house, 50 cubits high." 50 cubits. The gallows that Haman had built in anticipation of Mordecai's destruction. The king's response was immediate and final: hang him on that. So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. The man who had cast lots to determine the day for destroying the Jews became the first casualty of his own evil plot. The gallows he had built became his own execution site. The fate he had planned for another became his own fate. Throughout the empire, from India to Ethiopia, the law still called for the destruction of every Jew on the 13th day of Adar. The enemy was dead, but his legacy of hatred lived on, written in ink and sealed with royal authority. The battle was not over. It had only just begun. On that very day, King Ahasuerus gave to Queen Esther the house of Haman, the enemy of the Jews. Haman's vast wealth, his properties, his treasures, all of it was transferred to Esther. And Mordecai came before the king, for Esther had told the king how he was related to her. The king took off his signet ring, a ear to Mordecai. The same authority that Haman had wielded was now placed in Mordecai's hands. Esther set Mordecai over the house of Haman, making him administrator of the wealth that had been meant to fund genocide. The first decree could not be undone. The law was the law. But, and here was the opening, they could write a new decree, with the same authority, sealed with the same ring. The king's scribes were summoned at once. The new edict was written exactly as Mordecai commanded. Mordecai wrote in the name of King Ahasuerus and sealed it with the king's ring. He sent the letters by mounted couriers riding on swift horses bred from the royal stud. The couriers, mounted on their swift horses, rode out in haste, urged by the king's command. And the decree was issued in Susa the citadel. The Jews struck all their enemies with the sword, killing and destroying them. In Susa the citadel itself, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 men. They also killed the 10 sons of Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews. Their names were recorded: Parshandatha, Dalphon, Aspatha, Parada, Adalia, Aridatha, Pamashta, Arisai, Aridai, and Vizada. And the king said to Queen Esther, in Susa the citadel the Jews have killed and destroyed 500 men and also the 10 sons of Haman. What then have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? Now what is your wish? It shall be granted you. And what further is your request? It shall be fulfilled. Even now, even after all that had happened, the king continued to offer Esther whatever she wanted. His favor toward her had not diminished. Esther made 2 requests. If it please the king, she said, let the Jews who are in Susa be allowed tomorrow also to do according to this day's edict, and let the 10 sons of Haman be hanged on the gallows. The king commanded this to be done. A decree was issued in Susa, and the 10 sons of Haman were hanged. These were to be days on which the Jews got relief from their enemies, and as the month that had been turned for them from sorrow into gladness and from mourning into a holiday. Mordecai the Jew was second in rank to King Ahasuerus. Among the Jews, he was held in high esteem, for he sought the welfare of his people and spoke peace to all his people. The man who had once sat at the king's gate, unknown and unrewarded, now stood at the right hand of the throne. The man who had refused to bow to Haman now wore the royal robes of authority. The man who had saved the king's life, only to have the deed forgotten, was now remembered throughout the empire as the one who saved an entire nation. Mordecai used his position not for personal gain, but for the good of his people. He ensured their welfare, he advocated for their peace, he protected them from further harm. He became a voice for justice in the corridors of power, a reminder that true greatness comes not from demanding honor, but from serving others. The story of Esther and Mordecai became part of Jewish history, written down, preserved, passed from generation to generation. It became a story told to children, a reminder that when all seems lost, hope remains. When silence seems safest, courage is required. When the odds are impossible, providence prevails.